Our last speaker is a friend of North Dakota Corn, James Callan. He works out in Washington, D.C. I'd like to introduce James right now. James Callan owns James Callan Associates. He's going to cover farm legislation in an election year. Jim has worked for several years in the Washington, D.C. complex, specifically working on Farm Bill and crop insurance issues. Jim was a former employee of USDA Risk Management Agency in Washington, D.C. as an appointee of the Bush administration 2003 through 2009. His main emphasis now is working with groups like ours, North Dakota Corn Growers, on assisting with issues affecting agriculture, specifically public policy issues. Let's please welcome James Callan to wrap us up today.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dale, and the Corn Council and Corn Board. I know we have some board members here. Really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and be back in North Dakota. So I've got sort of a long PowerPoint. I recognize I'm between you and the drawing and the $3 off beer. So we'll try to make it a little bit fun. But I also look forward to your questions. So with that, let's get started. Policy developments last year, and that's what I'm going to cover initially, and then we'll get into policy issues this year, current Farm Bill and the future Farm Bill. I'll talk some about federal crop insurance, farm voices in Congress, the 2016 elections, and future challenges, needs, and opportunities for folks in agriculture. So last year, we had the Section 179, which is an important tax deduction for folks purchasing equipment and software. And I've been to one or two large farms out here, and I've seen the commodity trading operations in the farmhouse, and so I'm sure the software deduction will be beneficial to them. WOTUS, Waters of the United States. Interesting quote from Bob Stallman, the immediate past president of the American Farm Bureau Federation, calling it one of the worst examples of overreach. I don't think, Dale, others that I've seen a measure such as that has really rallied farm country in opposition to such a rule with such enormous potential impact. And I think it's really tied up in the courts now. So we'll see how that plays out, but Congress was prepared to act legislatively. I'm sure the president would have vetoed anything that they attempted to do, but it is tied up in the courts, so we have to see how that plays out. GMO labeling, there's a large coalition of which the National Corn Growers is a member, among many other groups, American Soybean Association and many industry players, attempting to work with the Congress to establish a federal voluntary labeling system for products that are based off of GMOs. It's been a very difficult fight. The House of Representatives passed a bill last July, which the industry strongly supports. It's now been in the Senate for over a year. Meanwhile, Vermont has enacted a statute that in essence is really could drive national policy, which is a mandatory labeling requirement. So it could be a very, very difficult situation for food and agriculture. Our view is that we don't want to see the technology stigmatized, and it should be voluntary. We're okay with labeling, but it shouldn't be mandatory because it'd have a negative impact all the way down to the farm. Renewable fuel standard, you're certainly well familiar with the RFS, with EPA coming out with its volume measures for levels for 14, 15, and 16. It did that late last year. We'll have to keep an eye on that going forward. It's going to be, I think, a continued tough fight when you have the oil industry and others who are very strongly opposed. You saw that in the Iowa caucuses. Most of the candidates were for it. The one candidate who was kind of against it, Ted Cruz, ended up winning the Iowa caucuses and did pretty well in farm-intensive counties in Iowa. So that's certainly that's certainly a big concern. So I think the battle will continue in that regard. So this year I mentioned GMO labeling, and other matters will include oversight. Congress will have a tough time passing legislation other than GMO labeling, if it is even able to do that. So it will focus on oversight. The House Agriculture Committee has long been attempting to get the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator, Gina McCarthy, to come up and talk about the many issues that are impacting rural America. There was a hearing scheduled January 26. We had a snowstorm in DC that you may have heard about, but it's now been rescheduled for February 11. So I would anticipate at that hearing that the focus would be on WOTUS, the RFS, as well as the pesticide review process that has taken a turn for the worst in the Environmental Protection Agency. There'll be other matters. Climate change, of course, will be an issue of discussion too, because it's so important to rural America. Current Farm Bill, we know that major crops are covered. Federal crop insurance was really the focal point of the Farm Bill. It was also a major component of the 2007 Farm Bill as well. I was serving at RMA at the time, second in charge of the program, and we saw that it was going to be an important part because the Farm Bill does not reauthorize federal crop insurance. It's its own separate statute. There was an increase of $5.7 billion in the current Farm Bill over 10 years for spending for crop insurance. You don't really get any of that. There wasn't an increase in subsidies. There wasn't an increase in the A&O, but they added the supplemental coverage option programs. So it's on top of your individual insurance if you like it. I don't necessarily think that's a popular option out in this part of the country, but nevertheless, it was something that they thought would make it more attractive to folks in other parts of the country and therefore gain support for the Farm Bill. Total budget authority. So it's all about numbers in DC, right? So $995 billion over a 10-year period. That's what the Congressional Budget Office has what they call scored the Farm Bill. 80% of it is made up of nutrition programs. There are total savings of $16.6 billion in the last Farm Bill over a 10-year period. And that was really significant because what other major program received specific targeted cuts? You had the sequester, which affected all the discretionary programs in government, but no other piece of legislation was enacted that reduced spending for a particular program. So farm country and farm legislators and everyone else who was involved in enacting that legislation after 2 years really deserve a tremendous amount of credit. So Title I is $44 billion for commodity programs, and now we see the shift to crop insurance, which is now at $90 billion. So the biggest part of farm programs clearly now is federal crop insurance. And I think that was certainly one of our objectives when we were serving in the administration, and I think it's been an objective of many, is to move away from disaster assistance, so we don't have any standings disaster assistance now, and move people to crop insurance. So it's working as intended, but there's risk still to the program, as I will show you going through these slides. You know that the bill's authorized, Farm Bill's authorized every 5 years. There's the budget realities, there's the World Trade Organization rules, the new revenue programs that we touched upon, that cover the shallow losses, which would be really the deductible plus with regards to your particular crop insurance policies. The process for the next Farm Bill, I think it's really already begun. House Ag Committee has been having hearings on SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, used to be called food stamps, and they've been looking at that, how to make it possibly more cost effective. One of the concerns has been you have folks who are considered able-bodied who have been collecting food stamps for a fairly long period of time, and that's brought a lot of concern to policymakers who have issues with people being dependent on government programs. I think probably most believe that the vast majority of recipients are not able-bodied and are actually, need the program. So there's been this evaluation, which I think really has started the discussion already about the next Farm Bill. And then the next question will be, as you talk about the next Farm Bill, as we get into it in a more specific manner, will they split out nutrition from the farm programs, as was attempted by the House during the debate on this Farm Bill? I think it makes it difficult for farm country to get what it wants in a Farm Bill. I mean, it's already difficult, but if you pull out the nutrition programs, which have been linked for many, many years, it could certainly make it a lot more difficult to have a viable Farm Bill and to protect the investment that's already there in terms of the budget dollars that have been allocated, and I think will be allocated going forward. Federal crop insurance, very complicated program. I'm always amused by what Colin Peterson, ranking member of House Ag, representative from western Minnesota, Red River Valley, not too far from here, he's always said that there are 5 people in the United States who understand federal crop insurance and farm programs, and they're all located in North Dakota. So it's pretty remarkable. And there's probably a couple of them right here in the front with Randy and Scott and Dale and maybe 1 or 2 others here. But it is a very complicated program, but it's a program I think that's worked very well. You could see it's 89% of planted acreage, 290 million acres. One of the speakers earlier talked about high levels of coverage in North Dakota. I mean, you all are almost off the charts. We're talking mid-90s in terms of the coverage for corn with federal crop insurance. I think you're number 1 or number 2 in the country, perhaps Minnesota and you, top 2 in the nation in terms of percentage of acres covered, particularly for corn. Just, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but just so you understand it, because I worked a lot with industry, which sells services and delivers the federal crop insurance program, as you know. The Risk Management Agency administers it and reinsures the program. So there's this reinsurance behind the program that provides a federal backstop. There's a board of directors, and I think a lot of us believe that boards of directors oversee the entire program. If you look at a board in terms of how it operates for an association or maybe a corporation. But in reality, in the federal crop insurance program, the board really reviews and approves policies, but it doesn't direct the RMA what to do. The RMA has a tremendous amount of authority in the federal government, and in USDA in particular. It's a unique organization in that respect. And in federal statute, there are words that say such sums as may be necessary to fund the program. In other words, to fund losses, to provide administrative and operating expense reimbursement for private insurance companies that sell, service, and deliver the program. So it has a unique status. It's the largest in the world. I think China's is now second. Canada has a good program, but theirs is all, I believe, government run. Japan has a mix of government and private, but it's mostly government. Spain is mostly government. They have a very good program as well. So people are actually looking to our program because of its unique setup, private-public arrangement. Revenue protection, most of you, I'm sure, have that with the harvest price option, and it's really not an option because you get it automatically unless you want it excluded. And of course, it adds to the cost of your insurance policy, but it's essential, providing upside and downside risk protection for you. It's the biggest part of the federal crop insurance program in terms of dollars, liability, and premium. It provides most of the indemnities. It's a great plan of insurance to have, particularly, you saw it a couple years ago with the drought and the increase in prices, so providing the upside protection, and then in the down year, providing the downside protection. So that, we'll get into that a little bit later in terms of the scrutiny that's under, because it's the most costly part of the federal crop insurance program. And here's a snapshot, the value of the insurance. The value of the insurance, we know that's gone down because commodity prices have dropped, because the value is pegged to the value of the crop, the amount of the value, the liability. And the acres insured have increased slightly during that period of time, and the total premium has gone down because the premium is pegged to the value of the insurance program. And again, with commodity prices dropping, it looks like a really good year in terms of indemnities, losses. You have a loss ratio of 0.50. That's as of mid-January, but I checked a little while ago, and it's not that much higher. I think it's 0.54. Now, we won't know probably until the end of the month what the final numbers will look like, but it'll certainly be below 1. And by statute, that's the target that the program likes to be under. So that's a great news overall for the program. So that means less money will be spent from the federal side of the equation, and you'll get fewer indemnities because there aren't as many losses. I thought I'd also pull out North Dakota corn specifically. You see the value of insurance has dropped. Again, with the drop in commodity prices, you've planted less corn acreage as a result. You can see the premium has gone down. And you can also see, however, and Randy, Bart, and I and others have talked about this, the good news story in terms of the loss ratio, how positive it's been. You're going to be much lower this year than states such as Indiana, Missouri. You'll be lower than Illinois. I don't think quite as low as Iowa. But the fact of the matter is, we've talked about this in the context of preventive planning. It's performing well. So why mess with preventive planning? The new rules that have recently gone into effect, they've been in effect 1 year. So leave that alone, is our communication with the Congress and with the Risk Management Agency. Probably don't need to remind you with this slide, farm income's gone down. We all know that, but I just wanted to emphasize again the importance of the farm programs to you all and to crop insurance. And looking at my role for you in Washington is really to protect your investment. I mean, that's the charge. When Paul and I and others talked about, Paul Belzer and I talked about, the future, it's really guarding against that and making sure that there aren't going to be changes that we certainly hope would not adversely affect you, particularly in a difficult economic environment for commodities. So I'll start to switch a little bit now to the political and congressional and presidential environment. Who are the key players? Well, we know that Senator Pat Roberts, chairman of the Senate Ag Committee from Kansas, was chairman of the House Ag Committee many years ago. Unique in that regard, is very, very important to the Farm Bill process and especially to federal crop insurance. He's considered the father of the modern program in terms of having a public-private partnership. Debbie Stabenow, a senator from Michigan, is the ranking member of Senate Ag, and she's been pretty supportive as well of the program, looking at it from a little bit of a different angle with more specialty crops in Michigan, but certainly they grow program crops there as well, and her office has been very good to work with. Mike Conaway, chairman of House Ag, he's from Texas, very supportive. There was a budget attempt to cut crop insurance, $3 billion from crop insurance over the next 10 years. In the recent 2-year budget agreement that was developed late last year, and he was instrumental, along with Mr. Roberts, in making sure that $3 billion cut did not happen. And Colin Peterson, of course, I mentioned him earlier. He's been very, very supportive of crop insurance. But there are others who are coming in to the picture whom we haven't really seen that much before, and that would be Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona, Senator Jeanne Shaheen from New Hampshire, and Representatives Ron Kind and Jim Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin. And I point out these folks, they're not household names. Mr. Flake has been somebody who has not been a big fan of farm programs and wants to reduce the federal budget overall, but they're going after the crop insurance program. My big concern is they don't really understand how the program works based on the proposals that they're advocating. So they're looking to reduce the subsidy, or they're looking to cut out the harvest price option subsidy component and have you all pay for that, or people making a certain amount of money won't get any subsidy at all. So then it really becomes something other than an insurance program, and it has implications for everybody else in the program. That's our argument in terms of our concerns with the potential cuts that could come about because of efforts by those members and others. I mean, there's no question that crop insurance is in the crosshairs in a tight budget environment. Now, with the recent two-year budget deal that was enacted late last year, President Obama negotiating with the Congress, and we have a two-year budget deal, and Speaker Ryan has not really been a big supporter of federal crop insurance. However, I spoke with Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's number 4 ranking House Republican. She's in the leadership. She said that it just has to be an ongoing effort with him, make sure we educate him on the benefits of crop insurance, and she thinks that he will, in the end, come around. But that's going to take a lot of vigilance. And while we have this two-year agreement, there are still risks that crop insurance cuts could emerge. Could be through budget reconciliation process, whether it's this year or next year, or other efforts to attach amendments that would reduce the federal crop insurance program and try to cut ag spending further. $10 billion per year cost to the federal government, crop insurance. That's about 1/4% of the entire federal budget, 1/4% of the budget. Not much money, really, in the whole context of it. And you have spending for farm programs, maybe around $4 or $5 billion per year, and you've got significantly more than that in terms of the nutrition program. So it seems to be a pretty good investment, providing essential backstop for you all for your insurance protection, as well as I talked to a lot of ag lenders, and I know they require you to have federal crop insurance in order to get at your operating loan. So it has potentially widespread impacts when you touch something here, and it could affect something on the other side. So it has broader implications than I think perhaps a lot of folks understand and appreciate. Now, your members are very supportive. We have great relationships with Senators Hoeven and Heitkamp. We reach out to them a lot, and Congressman Kramer, he's newer, but we've been to see him and his staff a number of times. I try to stay in fairly regular touch with the three of them. They've been very helpful on things such as preventive planning and the Ark County Yields Challenge. Obviously, they would be very concerned about any attempts to try to reduce funding for federal crop insurance or other parts of the ag safety net. Current political makeup. So we'll talk about the elections. We know that there's been a lot of attention with the 2016 presidential race, and then all members of the House are up for re-election, and about 1/3 of the Senate is also up. So you've got 247 Republicans, 188 Democrats. Most experts believe Republicans will hold the House. It's just difficult. There aren't that many competitive races, really. It would take quite a groundswell, I believe, for the House to flip. You would need, an extremely dynamic candidate on the other side of the aisle with major issues that are motivating and generating support for the country, as you had in 2006. But I don't think that's going to happen. Senate's 50 is a different story. 54 Republicans, 44 Democrats. You have 2 independents, and they caucus with the Democrats. So they hang out with the Democrats. They conduct legislative activity with them. They sit on the committees with the Democratic side of the equation. Bernie Sanders and Angus King. Bernie's from Vermont. Angus is from Maine. So it's really 54-46. So just because of the timing, you have 24 Republican seats that are up, 10 Democrat seats that are up for re-election. Next time it'll be almost reverse, and it's going to be tight. I would say it's probably up for grabs in terms of whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats who are able to have control of the Senate. Here are the senators that are up for re-election. There's been one change here. Rand Paul has now dropped out of the race for president, so he was running for re-election in the Senate in Kentucky as well as for president, but since he's dropped out now, he's going to be focusing on his re-election effort in Kentucky. Marco Rubio, of course, is running for president. He's not running for re-election to the Senate. So Florida is an open seat. I would say New Hampshire, held by Republican Kelly Ayotte, and Florida, currently held by Marco Rubio. Those two are really up for grabs. And the third would be Nevada, which is being vacated by the current seat holder, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Those three states will be really, really important to watch going forward. And then here are the Democrats that are facing re-election. You got a couple of retirements there. There might be one or two cheers for one of those senators on that list there. I think we all know who she is, and maybe one or two others as well. I mentioned the three toss-ups. I think if Republicans hold or at least one of those, New Hampshire or Florida, one of those, and pick up Nevada, which is possible, they'll probably hold the Senate. But then you also have states such as Pennsylvania and Ohio, which are currently held by Republicans, Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania and Rob Portman in Ohio, both pretty solid senators, probably going to be tough. Portman's running against former Governor Strickland. Toomey is running against, or maybe a rematch against Joe Sestak, former admiral, but he hasn't won the Democratic nomination. There are others who are also running in that race. So that could be a tough one for Republicans to hold as well. So it's going to be tight. It's going to be a close call. Probably right now it's 50-47, and those three states that I mentioned, and the possibility of Pennsylvania and Ohio flipping. Wisconsin, many think that Wisconsin and Illinois, currently held by Republicans, Ron Johnson and Mark Kirk, respectively, are probably going to go Democrat. It's going to be really tough for Republicans to hold those two, so that's why I'm counting them as likely Democratic pickups. So we got, as I mentioned, not many competitive seats in the House, maybe 9, according to The Hill, which is a pretty respected Capitol Hill newsletter publication. So you can see those 7 are Republican, 2 are Democrats. It's possible that if the Republicans nominate a controversial candidate, that you might lose. They might lose some seats in the House. They could also lose the Senate. It's quite possible. So it's going to depend. Usually, the top of the ticket has the most impact on the Senate races versus the House races. So that's going to be important to keep an eye on that. President Obama's approval rating, maybe it's ticked up now to about 47%, but it's been right around 46, 47% for about a year. Not really a very high number. A lot of folks say the president's approval rating is critical to the nominee of that same party. It's particularly critical if you're president. So his approval rating in 12, I think going into Election Day against Mitt Romney was around 49. He ended up with a couple of points above 50%. I think he ended up with 52, 53% of the vote. So you can see the correlation there. However, you look back to 2000, Bill Clinton had an approval rating over 60%, and Al Gore got just under 50% of the vote, or around 50% of the vote. So it's not always a direct correlation, but it's something to keep an eye on in that approval rating. And I think also the economy. We grew by 0.7% last quarter. If the economy doesn't pick up, stays sort of stagnant like that, or God forbid there's another terrorist attack, then it could be a real problem for the party that's currently holding the White House. So again, with the House, new census would take effect in 2022. It looks like, to the extent one can make a prediction, that the Republicans will hold the House at least until then. It's certainly possible it could flip, depending upon what's happening nationally. But I would think that would be something where they feel pretty good about the current makeup of the districts. So I think the controversies on the presidential front surrounding Hillary Clinton are probably unlikely to disappear. It seems to be more and more coming out on a periodic basis. I'm sure that's not a very happy thing for her campaign and for the folks that are advising her and for the candidate herself. A difficult situation there. But the other challenge on the flip side is that the demographics in the country, as we know, are changing. They favor the Democrats. You look at, say, California, Illinois, and New York, 104 electoral votes. I mean, almost assuredly going to go for whoever the Democratic nominee is. So that's 38, 39% of the Electoral College right there. So it makes it very, very challenging for a Republican candidate. I would say that the key states for Republicans probably are three, and that would be Florida, Virginia, and Ohio. I think if the Republican nominee wins those three states, he or she wins the presidency. But they have to pick up a state like Iowa and New Hampshire as well. Even though they're small states, it helps the margin. But I think overall the demographics in the Electoral College today favors the Democrats. But I do think it's a winnable race for a Republican candidate who can reach independence. Future challenges, we talked a little bit about, a lot about cuts to crop insurance, a little bit about our county yields, vulnerabilities to prevented planting, environmental rules, the sue and settle actions that we're seeing by the activist groups to knock down pesticides that have already been approved by EPA. They go to the court, they challenge a finding, it could be on endangered species or some other current federal statute, and the court stops the pesticide from being sold, restricts its use, and they're back to having to provide additional data and information, and it ends up being a very, very long and challenging process for folks who are providing those important tools for crop protection for you all. Commodity prices, input costs, RFS rollback. You all know that. Those are ongoing challenges and concerns going forward. Biotechnology, we talked about GMO labeling to some degree, potential overregulation. When you have products that take a new seed trait that might take 4 or 5 years to get approved, and the United States is telling its trading partners they need to have a more open and transparent and certain process to approve products that they may develop or the importation of products that we develop. So it seems hypocritical, and I think our trade negotiators understand that. We're also looking at a system that's risk-based here with regards to pesticide approvals, whereas folks abroad, maybe in Europe, for instance, look at a hazard-based approach. So we're advocating risk. They're saying hazard, but our regulatory system has now become more one lending itself to a hazard-based approach. So that's potentially problematic. But it underscores the need for alliances with food, nutrition, minority, and consumer groups, because political clout in rural America is not as strong as it was, and I think the political environment is more challenging now than it was. So you're going to need more allies. There's polarization within the parties, there's the budgetary pressure, the demographics and the food groups and so forth, the foodies. They're out there pushing a particular perspective, whether it's organic or no GMOs. So it all creates a challenging environment, and continued scrutiny of the crop insurance and farm bill spending and the other federal matters, including carbon caps and climate change and so forth. They're going to have to be dealt with and responded to effectively, and I think with the help of other groups. Sportsman groups, I would think, should be important allies, whether it's on conservation or other matters important to agriculture. Food and nutrition groups, tried to get some of those into that GMO voluntary labeling coalition. There's been some discussions with it. There were a number of members of the Congressional Black Caucus who supported the House labeling bill, which was favored by the industry, because there was a study that came out that said that there was a patchwork of different state laws that could lead to an increase in food costs. And so they were very concerned, folks representing urban communities. So there was an example of being able to reach across the aisle, go to groups with whom we may not always work very closely, and get them to support the position. And I think it worked very well with that example. Maybe there's opportunities also with Hispanic groups and religious organizations because of the importance of feeding people in need, and no one does that better than the United States agriculture. That's it. I'm happy to take questions. Got a little time, Dale.
I got a quick question, Jim.
Yes, sir.
The one slide you showed where the loss ratio of North Dakota, first year was like 0.96, 0.77, and 0.33.
Yes.
When would you see some of that maybe being reflected in the premiums we pay compared to Iowa? Can you repeat his question?
Yeah. Scott asked about the low loss ratios for North Dakota corn and how that might manifest itself in crop insurance rates for your policies, right? The way the agency works is that really they're supposed to make adjustments on an annual basis, but they're basing it more on very recent experience, so it should be reflected on a more regular basis than it has been in the past. So I would think that maybe over a few year period of time, you could see those rates start to come down. Those rates are important, but on the other hand, there's also the volatility on the revenue side. So if you see volatility in the commodity markets, those impact the rates in the other direction. So the loss history is one way, and then the other direction is the volatility when you have revenue insurance, which is tied to commodity markets. So it ends up being a little complicated, but I would think that when you have this a couple of years of really low loss ratios and maybe 1 or 2 more years, then I would think we would start to see it in a relatively soon. Mike.
Jim, the question I have is, now we have the prevent plant all ironed out, the 1 and 3 year rule. There's a lot of acres, I'm going to guess 500,000 acres in the state that don't qualify for the prevent plant anymore. Those acres are off the table. Wouldn't that reflect into our premiums also at lower premiums? Because it's been told that like 50% of our premiums that we pay are related to prevent plant claims. And if that goes away now with these acres, shouldn't that reflect?
Yes, absolutely it should. I mean, we've talked about that over the years about the impact of preventive planting. There's a pretty heavy load on the rates because most of the losses are in this part of the country or in North Dakota, South Dakota, the prairie pothole region for preventive planting. I think about 60% of it. There's been a lot of scrutiny because of it. We've seen attempts to revise it. It's been revised, the 1 and 4 rule now. And now they're still not content with that. They want to change it even more, but it's starting to work. And Scott and I and others have talked about that. We've communicated that to national organization, which has been supportive of the position of you all out here, which was done very ably by Randy and others to communicate that very effectively. So yes, long answer to your question, Mike. We should see a reduction in rates because you don't have the same amount of prevented planting claims that come forth. So what I'd like to suggest is we did this very effectively a couple of years ago when we went to Kansas City, which does the rates for the Risk Management Agency for the Federal Crop Insurance Program, is we probably need to go talk to them and get a sense of where this might come out and what the expectation might be for the impact on rates. So I appreciate that. Any questions? Other questions?
Yeah, Mike, on the GMO issue, who will be the GMO police? Who's going to monitor if that product is actually GMO free or contains GMO?
You mean at the federal level?
Well, if Vermont's issue and the GMO labeling becomes national,
right,
who's going to be the agency that's going to quantify that this product is GMO or doesn't have GMO in it?
Well, right now, let me talk a little bit, put it in a little context. You have the federal effort, and that's to try to set up a voluntary labeling program. And that would be run through U.S. Department of Agriculture with some interaction with the Food and Drug Administration. The problem with Vermont is that it has a lot of inconsistencies in the law as it's written. For instance, vegetable soup would have to be labeled as having GMOs, whereas vegetable soup with beef would not. So you can see the problems right there. So it would wreak a lot of havoc on the food distribution system, the labeling, the inconsistencies that could result, and it would be a real problem. I mean, I don't know how it would be, folks would be able to administer that if it were to become a national law. I mean, it would have to be, they're looking at options, for instance, in the Senate, of some kind of a QR code that people could scan and see if it actually contains GMO products. But it would be based off of involvement by FDA and USDA. I don't think anyone's really contemplated exactly how it would play out if Vermont were the national standard. And that's been one of the drivers at the federal level. I think folks on both sides of the aisle recognize that something has to be done by July 1, and it has to be done well before July 1. You've already seen Campbell's soup come out and saying it's going to label all its products that contain GMOs.
What do you think on TPP?
Do I think it's going to pass? Yeah. It's going to be difficult. It's an interesting question. The House is probably more favorable to it than the Senate. Now, if you go back to last year for the Trade Promotion Authority vote, whether to give the president trade promotion authority so they can negotiate agreement, and it would be an up or down vote by the Congress without any amendments, and many presidents have had that authority. The Senate passed it more easily than the House did. The problem was in the House. Now, fast forward, and the Senate is saying that Mitch McConnell, the minority leader, is saying he doesn't think he has the votes that he can actually get through the Senate. I think that probably has as much to do with the fact that you've got a third of the Senate up for re-election, and you've got a lot of Republican seats that are up, and there's a tobacco provision in there where tobacco doesn't have legal protection in these 11, 12 countries where the agreement has been negotiated. You got this pharmaceutical where the patent protection there for what's called a biologics path of drugs. There's not enough long protection in there as there is in the United States. I think it's 8 years versus 12. So those two factors, and some folks in ag don't think there's been enough market access for agricultural products. So it's a challenge. So I think the House is going to look at it a little piece by piece. Speaker Ryan has indicated that's what he'd like to do. I'm not so sure about the Senate, so it's hard for me to predict, but I would not be surprised if it doesn't come up for a vote. Correct. There's been talk about that it would be in a lame duck session, so that would be sometime after November 8 and before the end of the year. I think the signing ceremony was today in New Zealand, coincidentally, and but the Congress has to approve it in order to take effect for the United States to be involved. Got time for a couple more, Dale? Any other questions? Yes.
Does Vermont have anything to say about what the rest of the country does?
Really good question. You know, there were these ballot initiatives, right, that took place in different parts of the United States. I think there was one in Colorado, there was one in Oregon, there was one in California to require mandatory GMO labeling. They were all defeated, okay? So it becomes expensive for industry. However, in Vermont, I believe it was an actual law passed through the legislature and signed into law by the governor. So there's that process as well. So you have different state legislatures, and I believe New York And one other northeastern state has said once Vermont's law takes effect, we'll have a law that will similarly take effect. They're not going to go first. So it was a matter of Vermont being able to get a law through the legislature where the industry folks opposed to mandatory labeling were unable to stop the process in Vermont, and it was able to go through. And it has, you know, tremendous implications for labeling nationally as well as food prices, and a potential splitting of the industry coalition if folks start to get too close to July. We've seen Campbell's already coming out and saying it's going to require labeling. It's going to have labeling for all its products. That's going to be a problem unless this is resolved before, would hope well before July 1. And I should indicate, I'm so glad you asked the question, because I didn't indicate in my remarks that Secretary Vilsack has convened 2 meetings of folks from the industry and the anti-GMO side, the pro-mandatory labeling side, and they've been off-the-record meetings. They were both held in January, one in mid-January, one in late January. Understand he is going to continue those talks to try to come up with a federal solution, a compromise of some kind. And Senator Roberts, chairman of Senate Ag, has said he supports that process, and he's glad that the secretary has taken action. Whether that leads to anything, we don't know. Of course, it's helpful for the secretary to do that, but ultimately Congress will have to take action in the form of legislation. I think the White House would be supportive of whatever compromise came out. They've been reasonably helpful on this, with the secretary certainly getting the acceptance of the White House to proceed with meeting in this regard. He understands it. He understands agriculture, so I think he wants there to be a reasonable solution as well.
One last question.
Yes.
With the Corker rule that went through last year, that the way I understand it essentially made it so you didn't have to have a supermajority, you could pass treaties with just a majority.
Yes.
Is it possible for the Trans-Pacific Partnership to pass with just a simple majority?
I don't think there's been one easy question yet, Dale. My goodness. The Corker rule was for the Iran deal, if I recall correctly. So it was specifically for Iran. It was a bipartisan negotiation that was made between Senator Corker from Tennessee and Senator Cardin from Maryland, Democrat from Maryland. Corker's a Republican, chairman of the Center for Foreign Relations. So they came up with it, this agreement, so you wouldn't need a supermajority in order to approve or disprove. I think it was just to disprove the Iran deal. But I think it was just for that. I don't think it was not something that was a change in Senate rules that would have an impact on other treaties or measures that where you need at least we would need at least 60 votes or 2/3 in the case of a treaty in order to get approval. So I believe, though, in terms of TPP, I think it only needs a majority of each house. I don't believe it does not need 2/3. However, to your point, in the Senate, you can stop debate, and you need to invoke cloture, so you need at least 60 votes to make sure that the filibuster no longer is in effect. So you need at least 60 votes to do that. So in essence, you need a supermajority if that becomes a problem in the Senate. And that could be one of the things as well that McConnell is looking at, is maybe he's saying, well, gee, not only do I not have a majority, but I certainly don't have 60 votes either. So I think that would be something that they would factor into their decision making.